Well, I think the thing we'd like to talk about today is sort of a wide-ranging topic, and I invite your comments as we go along. Uh, Interference. Now, somebody pointed out, and I know you're here, Ed, that some Yankee fans provided interference the other night uh, to a player trying to catch a ball. That's interference. Interference is when the electric vehicle drives up next to you and your AM doesn't report. Interference can be any number of things. The commission is going to vote uh, next month's meeting on the geocasting plan to permit translators or boosters to separate programming for a few minutes an hour. And some folks, including the NAB, are worried that that will create interference. Uh, the FCC has already allowed or is allowing asymmetrical sidebands on HD stations, which can cause interference. And there's a chart, I guess, in their public notice that you need to look at to find out. But really, when you think about it, the FM band is so jammed, uh, especially on the eastern part of this country and on the West Coast. When somebody shares with me one of the uh, applications or these frequency searches they do, it's stunning to see these little slivers of land where you could place something, and sometimes they're as little as a quarter mile by a half mile or less. And the uh, the consultant will also recommend a directional antenna on top of that. So interference is an issue. Uh, we think about the problem that comes down with the 5G cell phone systems. And I've seen some material last week on one of the lists. You may be aware of this, you may not, that Verizon, among others, have started apparently to fill in on the 870 band. Is that what I'm thinking of? 850, 870, somewhere in there. And it's starting to cause problems as they shoot the signal to these sites uh, because of that old LTE thing that we talked about 8 years ago. Similar thing, radiation from FM stations, which are in compliance with the rules, but they prevent some of these cell sites from operating the way they want to. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. If someone has an experience they'd like to share, I think that's a great thing to talk about. And similarly, there was one note I read about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. I think it was someone who had registered their satellite receive site with the FCC was still receiving interference from the 5G. I wasn't sure if it was the satellite at the 3.7 gigahertz or whether it was a booster on the ground, but it certainly was a problem to be noted at. Go back about 20 years, and there was another form of interference, and that was the high uh, frequency augmentation on AM stations. Some stations were trying to get past the limitations of the NRSC or other things, and they were boosting the high end almost as much as the FM pre-emphasis curve. And as a result, the chatter from first adjacents and sometimes even second adjacents. And then there's the HD issue, uh, where they can create interference. LED stoplights. You drive up to an LED stoplight and you can find yourself in a very difficult place to hear things clearly. So I guess the first question that I'll pose, and I will pose it and see if you have any thoughts on it, is suppose you have interference, and let's start with AM. Suppose you have interference that you recognize. What's the first thing to do? What would you start? How would you diagnose this interference, for instance? Anyone want to share a thought? First, you have to listen to your station. Okay, that sounds amazing, but I just dealt with somebody 2 days ago, got a call from them. They were all upset. They were all uh, annoyed because they had been essentially off the air for a day and a half. Come to find out, they'd had a power flash, and the computer, which controlled things, locked up, and there's no audio. Why are stations not listening to themselves? Why do broadcasters not watch the quality of their stations? Last week, if you were with us with Frank, I noted that his new processor has some really great diagnostic screens, and we're going to invite his people back to demonstrate some of those. But you think about it, and you have all this problem of what's going on out there, and wouldn't it be nice to be able to look on the front panel of your transmitter or audio processor and observe what's coming in, going out? And now you can determine NRSC measurements each year are partially a way of remediating problems as capacitors go bad and spurs pop up around the band. If you've ever had an NRSC done and the person who did the job told you that you needed to knock down a spur, well, you've gone in there, and very often it's those big caps in the back of certain transmitters. But suppose you're on the receiving end of this interference from your first adjacent or something else. What do you do? Have you ever gotten to know the tech folks at the other stations? Have you ever made a phone call? Could be very simply uh, to get introduced, to talk about your EAS receptions that come or don't come each week. We may be competitors from our station to another station, one chain to another chain. And I know some of the chains, some of the consolidators, in fact, put out on their internal mailing list, don't talk to people that are not in our company, which is about as far as smart as I can think of. I remember many times over the years where we would share parts with our neighbors in town, help them get back on the air when they were off tubes. Don't have to do that too much these days, but in the early days, a pair of four dash 250s were very common to help someone get their transmitter back up, or 4-400s. Maybe you remember those. We had one station here in town, and that engineer is long since retired, but he had every single part of his transmitters 3 or 5 deep. If you needed an IC, he had one. If you needed a capacitor, he had one, and he was willing to share. And that, I think, is the sort of thing that needs to be ideally fostered in the SBE chapters. But the SBE chapters seem to be fading away in many places for different reasons, whether it's inconvenient hours to get together, or it's too far away, or the companies don't like sharing. I don't know. Uh, Again, I invite a comment here. What's it like in your area? Do you have a very good relationship with the rest of the market? I know you go up there on Vashon Island in outside of Seattle, and these guys all talk to each other. But I know
We
other,
oh,
yes.
we have a good relationship here in Omaha. Um, in fact, one of the groups here in town, I've got a 300-watt transmitter loaned out to them for their translator that went up in smoke here a couple weeks ago. And we know if we can help these guys out, we know we're going to get help if we need it. Um, that's mostly an engineering thing, although the managements of the groups, understand that,
A
hey,
little more
if
competitive, a little more competitive.
yeah, but as far as the engineers go, yeah, we kind of got our own little thing going, I guess.
Well, you almost have to because if you're really off the air and you're blocked, it could take two or three people to help diagnose something, whether it be out in an ATU or in the transmitter itself. Uh, I got a note from someone this morning talking about how he runs into IT people all the time that really don't understand RF systems at all, don't have any kind of test gear or instrumentation. And we're going to do some tips, I think, little articles, at least that's what I'm planning, to help mentor the new folks, which I think is what the BDR should be all about, helping folks, whether they're brand new in the industry or been there for 50 years, to do their job, to get it done more easily.
Well,
Uh,
I've been chasing a problem here in my Axia stuff, where I have pops and clicks in the audio, and it's coming around to the point where the support at Telos is throwing up their hands and they don't know what it could be. Um, I think it's either something in the node itself, so we've nailed it down to that, but um, either it's a software issue or something hardware. The node has got some age on it, but I've gone through three other guys, trying to figure this out. Ed Bucant, talked to him a number of times to try to come up with some things. I've got a workaround that I've managed to come up with through the engine, um, virtual mixer to do what I need to do, and it's clean, so it's getting us by. But yeah, you got to talk to these other people. It's all two heads are always better than one when it comes to trying to figure things out.
except when they're on the same shoulder.
Well, okay.
Sorry, it just my beginnings as a disc jockey never go away, you know?
I know.
You have to get that stuff out.
Abby and Brittany.
What's that, Jeff?
Abby and Brittany.
Wow.
I remember in both New York and Boston, we had pretty good uh, relationships with the other stations.
Was
New-
that before or after the great consolidation, Rich?
uh, no, actually, it was before. But we had fairly regular rubber chicken dinners where everybody, gave awards and that sort of thing. But
Oh,
in Boston, we could cooperate with the exception of Westinghouse. We were GE, and we were forbidden because of price fixing things, forbidden to talk to anyone from Westinghouse. Otherwise, all sorts of cooperation.
well, that's good to hear. Uh, again, I can tell you that uh, as I began my career as a chief engineer and worked building stations in this area, I got a lot of help from some of the other stations, and some of the guys would come out in the middle of the night. Some of the guys would call up and say, "I need some help. I don't know what to do about this." And
I think they just died.
we were we were a little we were a little how shall I say uh, close. In fact, I remember a time when we had 15 uh, engineers at lunch once a month. You couldn't get 15 radio engineers in this town in a fire sale today. But it was after the Great Consolidation began that I heard stories about the proprietary mailing lists and don't talk to the guys across the street. It just a sad thing. And now we had a chapter of the SBE here, and in the last couple of years of its operation, I think I was the only radio guy that was showing up, and maybe a couple of TV guys, TV cable, and sometimes the presenters outnumbered the attendees. So they eventually collapsed the chapter, and it's now sort of combined with the Phoenix group, which means to get to one of their meetings, it's only a 125-mile trip. So getting information, getting help from others is not as easy as it used to be for various reasons. And so getting to know the tech support folks, getting to know the suppliers, you may call Mary up at Broadcast Depot, and she may know that's one of her other clients has dealt with a very similar problem and turn you on to them. And that's the sort of collegiality we like to see. Now, there's so many other things it could be. You could find staying with AM for just a moment more, you could find interference from power lines. The power companies are less and less observant when transformers go bad. And it used to be that if you called in and said, you've got a bad transformer on a pole out here in the corner of such and such and such and such, there'd be somebody out there real quick, and they would find it and fix it. But that has not become the common factor anymore. You have to kind of really press on it. You have to really be insistent to get their attention, or that interference from that power transformer or that stoplight or whatever the source is will continue. What about your STLs? Have you checked lately to see? And now a lot of people go to IP, and in one sense that's really good. In one sense, there's other issues like latency, but all too often, folks are throwing up their STLs without even checking frequencies or polarization, and this is not something that comes instantly. But if you hear a little noise in the bottom of your signal, could be one of your neighbors. I remember Clear Channel had a station here where they had a power outage at the studio, and all of a sudden the transmitter starts playing music from another foreign language station. And it turns out that their STL was pointed almost directly at the receive site and on the same polarization. And nobody said a word about that when they put it up. But when the power went out, boom, you were in trouble. Moving over to FM. You have some problems with FM, don't you? HD could become a problem because of the sidebands. What I'm hearing more and more, though, as I said at the beginning, is an issue with the cell phone companies. Some of them will send out a tech with a spectrum analyzer, and they say, "Well, you're preventing our cell system from operating." Has anyone with us today had that issue?
Oh, yes.
Yep, we had one.
Okay. What did they say to you?
Well, for us, it was a ninth harmonic issue that was supposedly interfering with their minus 98 dB receive, goal. And we decided, rather than trying to fight that, we would just, you know, uh, bite the bullet and buy a notch filter and take it out. But it ended up costing us several $1,000s, but probably cheap compared with what AT&T could do to us.
Yeah, if they get the lawyers involved. But minus 98, they were really kind to you, weren't they? I've seen cases where they come out, they want 100 or 115. One tech even wanted 125. Now,
Yeah, hardly possible.
the the reality
Okay.
is, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to join in, but the AT&T one, it predated when I was at this before I took over at JCU again. But the previous Mark Krieger, the previous chief engineer, they installed the new Nautel, and they were getting complaints from the AT&T cell site across the street from where the studios were, which was like hidden in a chapel in the church. I mean, on the bell tower in the church. And it's like, well, what are you talking about? And they went round and round, but it turns out that on the transmitter, the lid to the transmitter wasn't sealed quite enough, so some harmonics were just peeking out between the seams between the metalwork on the transmitter, and so Nautel redesigned the lid, and when they put that on, that shut AT&T up. So interesting.
Yeah, I've heard of that fix and other fixes because of cabinet radiation. Uh, Everything from cloth shrouds to chicken wire, uh, making up a Faraday cage in effect. Um, but the point is that FM stations have to be where? Where do you have to be on the spectrum to be legal? Minus what?
80 dB down.
There you go.
80 dB down below carrier.
So when they come in and they want 90 or 98 or whatever,
Well, it's a local cell carrier here in Nebraska, and they wanted 120 dB down. And we did find that the transmitter that was being used it was a translator. It was an older Crown, and yeah, it was leaky. We swapped it out with a newer transmitter that was a lot better as far as concealing the RF, but yeah, they get real picky about it. Unfortunately, in this particular case, it was a matter of the cell technician actually got a hold of the guy that had the translator and said, "We have a problem." It wasn't one of these cases like Verizon, for example, where they just simply call the FCC and complain right away. They don't tell you that there's a problem until you get a letter from the FCC or a visit. So these people were really good to work with as far as, trying to get the problem, get it taken care of. And of course, being a tenant, this group was a tenant on their tower. So, you about have to play by their rules for sure. But
that does become an issue. First in, first out. Who owns the tower? And
right,
if you are a renter on a tower and the cell guys come in, the owner of the tower may be more interested in the money from the cell company than acquiescing to the FM station. One of the
Could be.
problems,
Oops.
yes,
I was going to say, it's been 15 years now. I had a deal where my STL transmitter generated a 10th harmonic that they were complaining about. And the antenna was pointed directly at their cell site, but it was 6 miles away. But it turned out to be a real problem. And I went through the transmitter and found the offending capacitor that had opened up. But they were not real polite about it. Today things break. Give me a chance to look at it. Okay, I see the same thing you see. Let me fix it. They were threatening lawyers before they were trying to solve any technical issues. The guy just said, "Turn it off."
Yeah.
Said, "No, we're not going to go off the air, but we'll make an attempt to see if we can figure it out." They were just unreasonable. This was AT&T was the complainant.
Well, that's the issue, and that's why I'm bringing this up right now for several reasons. First of all, you have all kinds of different techs, some that actually have experience and some that, well, they don't understand receiver overload, for example.
Yes.
Is that what you had, Mark?
No, this was actually a good old spur coming out of a mostly STL, an antique thing. A cap had become 2 pieces of metal.
Yeah,
And,
that's an issue. How many
when I
radios?
saw it on the dummy load, I said, "Oh, it's real."
Well, this is an issue that radio, of course, I think has largely been at fault with for many decades, and that is not having any measurement or test gear to understand what their signal is doing. I think if you have one of the newer Nortels, for instance, that have the screen on the front panel that show you the spectral. I mean, this is something that radio stations never had until probably recently.
But it doesn't help either that the FCC has gone lax on a lot of the technical rules that they used to have, where you had to do proof of performances and so on and so forth.
Exactly.
Just to keep up with what your stuff was doing. And yeah, I agree. A lot of the solid state stuff has gotten to a point where it's pretty reliable, but and things aren't going to drift, but things happen. And I know once a year I make it a point to take the spectrum analyzer and I check occupied bandwidth. Well, it's not required that I have to do that, but I do it anyway because I want to see what my stuff is doing.
And you have a spectrum analyzer.
Yeah.
It's a real good idea. Just if you are doing that, just to take photos with your your cell phone.
Yep.
Which show the date, time, and where you were when you took the picture.
Exactly. That's exactly what I do.
I don't recall any requirement ever to check more than annually.
Right.
And of course, there's no requirement now, but if you check annually, you're at least making an effort to be aware of potential things,
Well, it's like checking frequency too. And granted, a lot of the new stuff we're not as quite as concerned, but you still like to check frequency once a year or twice a year.
I don't. My Nautel does not do this, but I wish it would reference the GPS signal I'm sending the transmitter. The signal's there for the HD. Why don't you use that to, keep it all on exactly on? But they
on
don't do
frequency.
That.
Yeah.
They don't do that. I wish they would. A couple of years ago, I had a deal where the engineer had picked 947 megahertz as the STL for a 94.7 transmitter. And I kept getting complaints from a Golden Ear PD that they could hear something in the background. It turned out the transmitter was interfering with the STL at the 10th harmonic. I never could solve that one. That was pretty weird.
Sounds like a good place for them to change the STL to a different frequency.
I got uninvolved with that company before it was solved, but that was my suggestion. There were plenty of STLs to pick from at that time, and the radios were agile, so they get in there and spend the coordination fee and change it.
Sure, but
I couldn't ever hear that interference he was hearing. He's the golden ears, but I could see it on the scope. It was pretty. It was way down there.
well, it can be far down, but it can still be audible. I had a station up in Denver some years back where there was this just it wasn't really something you could hear unless it was a soft passage or somebody was talking for a period of time, but it was there. And eventually, I discovered that one station had an AM and an FM, and they changed the way they fed them. And what it was that their station was directly in between our studio and the transmitter, and he chose the same frequency and the same polarization. And I'll add one more thing to it. It drove me nuts when I found out. Their engineer was the frequency coordinating guy for the city.
I've had an engineer just arbitrarily pick a frequency and show up and take over my STL.
Yeah, they do that. And of course, with the RPUs, that was the game for the networks when they would come in for sporting events. They'd pick a channel, talk out on it, and if nobody responded, oh, it's ours. And it may be a repeater channel or a channel with a tone guard on it, but they would just go ahead. I told this story before. I got called by a jock one morning and asked me why all this profanity was coming through his Q speaker. And eventually I tracked it down to an NBC crew at the basketball tournament. They decided to just patch the director into the RPU channel.
Hey, Barry, that's a little surprising. In my brief career at ABC, I used to have to do the frequency coordinations for Monday Night Football. And although we didn't use a lot of 450 frequencies, most of the networks have a guy whose responsibility is to work with the local SBE coordinator and get use of a frequency or get directed to a frequency that might be available and who owns it. So I'm surprised that a crew just showed up and picked a frequency because, as I said, I know at NBC, this is obviously a number of years ago. Lou Libman used to take care of it for NBC, and like I said, for a brief stint, I used to take care of it for ABC. So yeah, certainly had the right to go down to the arena, find the technical director, and go punch him in the nose. But as I said, generally, at least in my brief experience with the networks, they were very careful about frequency coordination and used to try to get STAs to get on frequencies that the locals typically would not be authorized for. So again, a little surprised, but it obviously it happened.
Well, it did. It had happened repeatedly, as a matter of fact, in this city. Part of it was before, and part of it was even after the SBE frequency coordinating committees were set up, because I was part of the original arrangement on that when it was set up in Vegas during the NAB show. And I also spoke to the NBC one of the vice presidents who was supposedly in charge of that. And I said, "Why do you do it this way?" And because they had some guys who were just lazy and did not want to contact any local stations, because again, the FCC records, they would know who was licensed on that channel. But it was, we're the big guys, we're in here and we got this big truck and we need to have frequencies. had it happen at college basketball games, had it happen at golf tournaments, had it happen at baseball games, spring training. It did. But I'd like to jump back to the part where Mark was talking about the spectrum analyzer. Because most radio stations still don't have them, especially the smaller ones. And similarly, a lot of the problem, if you actually went out with the test gear and looked into this, you would find a lot of non-directional AMs are not right. They're not on their proper resistance and the power that's going out because nobody's checked their ATU in 30 years. All it takes is signal generator, no YB, but how many stations in a small market can afford them or want to afford them? I think this is something that should be a little bit more easily arranged as a service, perhaps with a decent cost factor. But I think the fact that stations run for so many decades without being checked, there's a lot of stuff out there that's not right. Mark mentioned frequency. Most people used to check their frequency every month. Now I know of stations that haven't done so in years. I'll give you another example of why test gear is important. I used to enjoy setting up a scope on my workbench, which I would tune around to different stations and take a look at the Lisa pattern. And I determined over a short period of time that the number 2 slot in a 3-deck cart machine was out of phase. Now, you know what the situation was. Obviously, the jocks were listening to program, not off the air. Nobody knew. Nobody was paying attention, unless, of course, it was somebody who had a clock radio in mono and realized they couldn't hear voices. And so I just find a tremendous number of stations, and even today with digital setups and IP audio, you can get out of phase. It's not that hard.
Well, I was going to add another thing to check is the yield SCL transmitters besides the main, FM or AM transmitter, both for frequency and spectrum. And I will say these days you can afford a spectrum analyzer, but most people are not trained how to use it either. And it's like most test gear, if you don't know how to use it, you can wander down a real long path and get off into weeds.
So is there ever a solution for this? I don't know.
Training, but nobody wants to pay for it.
No one wants to pay for it. Reduced engineering staffs. Stations don't even bother to have engineers anymore.
There's very little enforcement from the commission, so the fear of the FCC is not what it once was either.
Well, that's true. Which kind of peripheral thought here. See what you think about this, Ed, and maybe someone else. If you know that a station in your market is throwing a spur, maybe Mark, you've got your spectrum analyzer, and you find out that the next guy down the dial is throwing a spur. It may not be on your channel, but it's there. Do you call the commission?
I would tend to call the engineer, but these days there is no engineer. In my little market, there's 3 of us. At least I can call the other guy and say, let's have lunch and we'll talk about it. But, there's 2 stations that have regularly paid engineers, and I'm one of them, and that's it. everybody else just calls the firemen when something goes wrong. So nobody's checking anything till it goes off the air. You know, that's just a new reality.
So in that case, would you call like the station manager or something?
I have done that, but I happen to know them all. It's small enough market, you know. Or I've called them on the out of phase thing, say, hey, somebody wired something up wrong, and you may want to get that looked at. But they don't. You know, it's very hard to get them to get up and do anything until it goes off the air. Then they're in a panic.
I was recently contacted by somebody who had a station that he worked with in Texas and wanted to know about another station in that market who the engineer was. Because when they called the station, all they ever got was a voicemail.
Well, the great number one radio company here in this market has nobody local. They had a contract engineer for a while, then they have a different contract engineer, and they have an employee engineer over in Houston, which is 4 hours drive from here. That's all they got. Nobody's here locally looking at anything till it quits. And that's how the number one company is running their enterprise.
I think one time when I had to try and find contact information for a station, and it usually works, but you may not, you might not get an engineer, but if you just have no way to contact anybody, go to their main page. Somewhere down in the very bottom will be that link that sends you to their public file, and there will generally be an address and a phone number there, and you're probably going to get a receptionist or something. But you can kind of say, look, I got this off of your public file. You need to respond to me, rather than just letting it go to an answering machine.
It's a good point.
Well, the other thing you can do is you can pretend you want to buy an ad to get a hold of a human. But even number one radio station company is now selling all those centrally. There's no local personnel here selling ads or beating the bushes or anything. It's all done remotely.
I'm going to say when they all go into the cloud and your transmitter site is only a node, you won't even have a door to knock on or a building to go to.
So at what point do you call the commission or use the complaint form on their website?
I personally really try and avoid that, because calling the commission very seldom is going to get you anything faster than what you could do to play detective. And I'd rather approach it as a little more of a, I'm old fashioned, I guess. I'd rather be a little friendly about it, insistent but friendly. But
well, being friendly is good, and that collegiality, I think, is important. But when the regional director came on with us last year, he pointed out that he gets an email within 15 seconds of something being entered into a portal. Now the question becomes, we're dealing with spurs, shall we say? We're dealing with interference from some issue where somebody's on a frequency they shouldn't be on. What about overmodulation? Would you turn your next door neighbor in for overmodulation? Some people will say, if you do this, now they'll figure out who it was and they'll be watching you.
Yeah.
Well, we had a situation back when I was in New York. There was a Class A FM running the same format as us up in Westchester, and our program director noted that they were louder than we were, and we surreptitiously went up there and measured them, and we said, yes, they're running 125% modulation. The only difference is they don't have any subcarriers, and we do. So they're just, as Frank Foti pointed out, this way they're going to be 2 dB louder than we are. So we sent them a friendly note saying, we see what you're doing, and we're not going to tell the commission, but we think you should fix it. And that's as far as it ever went. I don't find any value in turning somebody into the commission. I think if you tell somebody, we see what you're doing, fix it, especially in the modulation area, at least in the short term, you'll get I found you'll get a response. In the long run, I'm sure, a month later, they probably turned it back up again. But this was a case where they were doing higher modulation than technically allowed because they weren't running the subcarriers, but they were hitting 125%.
I ran across one time an AM station, a directional, that did not change their power and pattern until about 25 minutes or so after the proper time. And eventually, it's funny because I actually went to their general manager, their owner, and his response sadly was, "What's it to you? Are we interfering with your station?" And I said, "No, I'm just trying to be collegial and tell you about this." And he didn't care. A few years later, I came into the station on another purpose, and we discovered what it was. It was an old computer where the clock had drifted 25 minutes. And the power changes were 25 minutes late. That was an easy fix, but it could have been fixed years before. Who was it that said we haven't seen very many FCC inspections? Well, that's true. Pandemic shut all that down dramatically, but it's starting to come out now when they have time. Broadcast is not the major thing for the FCC, especially the reduced enforcement arm. Many of the field offices have been closed, and the trucks that went around are not going out as often, unless there is a report of interference with air traffic control, for instance, or a police frequency. But if that happens, they are out there pretty quick. But they also have to handle the complaints about cell coverage and cable coverage and all the other stuff that they're assigned to do. Part 73 is not the total of the parts of the FCC rules and regs. It goes up into the past 100, So it just give you an idea of the many different things that the FCC has its fingers in.
I used to take care of a station in South Dakota, and a translator moved their antenna just below ours, and so I grabbed my spectrum analyzer and noticed that there was a small intermod spur in the aircraft band. So fortunately, it was not on any of the frequencies being used in Sioux Falls, but I notified the translator's owner, and within a couple of months, there were some cans on the output of that transmitter. So
And so how did it end out?
oh, they put some filtering in it, and it cured it. So I mean, I notified them so that they wouldn't get in trouble with the FCC. So because I know they take aircraft band interference a lot more seriously than it would if it fell anywhere else, pretty much.
Yeah. Yep. Got a call once from the tower that we were interfering with their ATC, and I said no. uh, we have a clean transmitter here and it's not us. Oh, yes, it is. We know it's you. And, tried to be cooperative and actually put on the spare exciter and tried the spare transmitter, no difference. Went on down there and spoke with them in person, and we were trying to figure out what their problem was. And they said, well, it's a country record. It had to be you. And finally, they brought a guy in from LA with a system to find this and discovered it was an intermod signal coming from a water tower west of town that was involving two other radio stations. We were not involved at all. So don't really want to jump to conclusions. You want to have some sort of realistic evidence that your signal is wrong or your neighbor's signal is wrong or just like that. And as I used the word before, collegiality. That's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we keep things as professional as we can. But there are people out there that don't care. Sometimes they report that their tower was stolen overnight. That's why.
Can't imagine that happening.
Well, I know it's in your inventory now. You and your bridges and towers. You're be a wealthy guy one of these days.
I sure hope it happens soon.
So I guess as the discussion of interference it looks like there is not too much of it out there, at least among you folks that are with us today. And I'm happy to hear that. There was a continuing thread that I hear about the cell phone issues, largely because of the reuse of that frequency band. But even with the 5G and the downlinks and things like that, you have to be careful. And I think there's more interference out there that we know about simply because stations are not being monitored as closely. The station here that was off the air for a day and a half before they realized it, or go down to Atlanta again, and the station had not been inspected for 4 to 6 months. It turned into a meth lab.
Barry, I can mention one other form of interference that I didn't hear anyone mention. And this happened to KQED last year at a translator site. The translator was to do fill in for a valley city called Martinez in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we did an upgrade, moved some antennas around, gave us a chance to be at the site, which normally just ran without any problems. And what we noticed was a co-channel station on the other side of a range of mountains had turned on their HD, which they hadn't before. And so all of a sudden, we would tune in our translator, and after a few seconds, we would get the other co-channel's HD in our receiver, and our audio would completely go away. I was a little freaked out about this at first, but needless to say, once I drove down from the hilltop where the translator was on, the signal from the HD went away, and we got nothing but our station at that point. So I'd say of the total audience for the translator, perhaps 5% of the people that receive that transmitter live in an area where if they have HD radios in their cars, by the time they drive home in the evening or when they get up in the morning to go to work for a brief period of time, they get the other co-channel's audio when they tune in 88.1.
Indeed.
But you have to be sitting in your driveway, right?
Or sitting in your driveway, or sitting in your work vehicle next to a tower on top of a hillside in a public park where the
Yeah,
transit.
we had an incident here with KUSC I heard about. There is a distant co-channel station that is non-HD. And it's kind of a twisty, turny mountain road, and you drive, if you're listening to that station and you drive around, all of a sudden KUSC's HD will capture the receiver, and it'll just segue right over to the others, to KUSC, until it loses KUSC. They got some complaints about that, but I guess the best solution is to make the other station do HD, and then everybody's happy.
Well, at this point, it's kind of hard to do HD with the translator.
We have one in Tampa that's doing HD with a secondary, an HD2.
HD is causing interference? Who would imagine such a thing?
Mutual, how do they call it? Mutual assisted destruction.
Mutually assured destruction.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I think Rich's favorite term for that was iBuzz, right?
Yes, it was. Properly spelled IBUZ.
CD quality, I know.
Actually, our stations are rather interesting. We don't have any really high-powered transmitters in our arsenal, but here in East Texas, we've got 2 stations, and between those 2 signals, we've got 9 transmitters. So it is kind of hard to keep an ear on all of them all at the same time. But and I actually had to turn on a couple of them this morning when I was coming to work due to some storms that are happening, but they weren't off. Well, I listened to them last night sometime before too long, but we have more problem with atmospheric interference than we do people interference. And
I was just about to use the word ducting. Tell us.
Definitely ducting. That's our biggest problem. And a lot of times in the mornings, I can hear our AMs better than I can hear our FMs.
How often is your station taken over by ducting?
Probably 3 or 4 times a week.
Wow.
Yeah, quite often. And like I said, none of them are particularly powerful. And Tyler is 25 miles away from my house, and my house is well, I'd say Tyler's about 40 miles away from here. And but we do cover Tyler, and all around East Texas, we've got a bunch of little transmitters.
I think Florida, Jeff, maybe you've got some experience here. I've heard Florida is a really hotbed for ducting, and a lot of stations there will actually put 2 STL receive antennas, one toward the top of the tower and one well down, because of the duct layer will overtake the top one.
It's funny you mentioned that too, because we used to, when I first came here, I noticed there was a lot of ducting. Where I really had a lot of interference was at the Jersey Shore, because you had the Long Island stations coming right across the water. They were to me, I thought they were a lot worse.
Is that ducting, or is that just lack of attenuation over distance?
No, it was ducting, because it wasn't all the time. It would just come in and some of the Connecticut stations would just come in and overpower. But no, that was really more of a problem up there. But you even had the short spacing back then too, though. So yeah,
I recall when I was in college, receiving Florida TV stations in Boston, for maybe half an hour at a time.
You used to see that up in New York when we would get those weather inversions. We'd get the Philadelphia stations coming into New York like a local one Saturday morning. The general manager of the station I worked at called up and he goes, "What's wrong with the station?" And I go, "Nothing." So he's hearing because there was a co-channel in North Philly on a tall tower. So he was hearing the Philly station up in Connecticut while we in Metro New York were hearing our station and tried to explain ducting and inversion to the general manager of the radio station. It's like, it's a thing. It happens. No, there's nothing I can do about it. It'll go away when the weather changes.
Yeah, that's a normal part of microwave engineering. That's called space diversity. Another diversity is frequency diversity, where you go to a different band. This is nothing new. And by the way, there's a sandbox that you can play with this. It's called amateur radio.
But Barry, I'll give you one last interference example. It's not exactly broadcast, but it was involved in my time at Sirius XM. The frequency Sirius XM is on is 2.3 and a couple more threes gigs. So it's just a little bit lower than your microwave oven and not too far from where all your Wi-Fi stuff is. It's the old part of the near the ISM band as well. So Amazon sold a plethora of different devices, point-to-point links, Wi-Fi links, all kinds of things that came from other countries that did not have any kind of Part 15 approval on them. And we had two guys in the company who, besides running around the country with a spectrum analyzer, was also constantly on the phone with Amazon pointing out products that they were selling that were not legal to be sold in this country. But they spent, like I said, it kept two guys employed for years just chasing after these things and constantly calling Amazon and saying, you can't sell that. And once in a while, they had to go to the commission and tell them Amazon is selling, such and such. So, like I said, it was an issue because it caused local interference into the either the satellite or the repeater signal of the Sirius XM repeaters. So and I think to this day that not necessarily those guys, but that group is still there, still chasing sources of interference when they crop up.
I know
I'd
that
throw my hat into the ring of two interference stories. Yeah, I'm a bit of a neophyte when it comes to RF. I guess I fall in that category, but um, I was sitting in my driveway, pulling in my driveway, and I pulled in all of a sudden my station. I'm at 90.7 FM in the New York City area. Pull in my driveway up in Westchester, signal suddenly changes to something else, and it sounds like public radio. And I thought, did someone hit a button? Did someone do something odd? And I'm watching this, and all of a sudden the readout, the RDS on my car, flips over real quick to another radio station. I forget what it is at the time. So I wrote it down and scribbled it real fast and make note of it. And then I found it was a station out of Florida, coming in loud and clear, RDS and everything. I thought that was the neatest thing. I thought that was pretty cool. And then the other story I have recently is we have an STL 950 megahertz pointed south out of the Bronx down to Manhattan, unfortunately. And as we're gearing up for a big project, all of a sudden I hear dropouts, and I look at my colleague and I'm like, I've never heard that before. What's going on? We go investigate, and after a while, we find out that there's some interference on our STL, which for 18 years, knock on wood, hadn't been a blip, but all of a sudden it was a significant dropout. So again, I don't know enough about RF, but thankfully I have a colleague who who I work with who knows more than I do, but set up an analyzer, and we rigged up a whole setup where I would flip over to audio over IP the backup that we have, and just sat there with the analyzer watching this and staring at it. And I got really excited to finally find where the interference was coming from. I don't know where it was or who it is still, but just two little devil horns pop up right next to our frequency at in the 950 megahertz range. So I thought that was like, the most exciting thing to finally see it, that I'm not going crazy, after chasing this down for a week or more. So anyway, my little story to share with you guys.
Interesting. Thank you.
I thought about actually using the PI code. So in other words, if the station was being overrun, it would then the PI code would be different. So that if it sensed that the PI code wasn't what it was supposed to be, it would switch over to the IP. It's one of the pet projects that I'm working on. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but
some of the BW broadcast transmitters and had that feature where you could put in your PI code and it would actually switch. It was quite handy, although unfortunately there was a time delay between one source versus the other that we had, so it didn't really work well for us because of that.
Okay. What was that time delay?
Internet. That was our backup, was the internet. We're picking it up off over the air as the main feed, but it was using a internet feed as a backup, and it just wasn't time aligned. There wasn't a way to time align it.
Right. You had too much latency. Yeah.
It's not just the stations that have to be aware of interference, because as a dealer, it's our responsibility to make sure that the products are certified and won't cause interference. I know that there's been some companies that's gotten assist and desist letters from the SCC not to stop selling products that are not in compliance.
Yeah, I remember that, and we know who that was. Don't need to talk about it.
There's been a couple. There was one like about a year ago.
Yeah, the FCC issued either an NOV or an ALF, one or the other, on that. And there's good grief. You go onto eBay, and within 5 minutes you can find cheap transmitters and walkie-talkies, two ways, ham gear at ridiculously low prices, but ridiculously high interference.